right, and we will go ahead and get started. I am, again, very pleased to welcome all of you here today and very happy to welcome back Rick Goodwin. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Becky. Good to be here. Yes, and folks, we have our focus today in this webinar. It's called Mapping the Past to the Present, Coping Mechanisms versus Strategies. That's a lot of words there. We're going to get into what this is about. But I'm going to say this presentation is going to be more of an exercise for you. And I do encourage you to consider it an exercise, and you may wish to have a pad of paper and a pen handy, because we'll be asking questions to you all, and we can work on those questions. We can discuss those contributions you may wish to make make this concept come alive. So that's our focus today. We're looking at post-traumatic expression, and even though I'm often my webinars with Zero Abuse tend to be about working with men, as that's the focus of the clinic I manage here. Today's presentation is applicable to all folks of all genders. So yeah, so give it some thought, and we'd love to hear from you in the chat function. So before I get into any of that, though, we got to acknowledge who brings this show to your screen, and that's the good people of the U.S. Department of Justice. Through a granting process, allows Zero Abuse to deliver programs and services like Survivor Space. So we're very thankful for the folks at Justice. You know where your tax dollars are going, and let's kind of get into the matter. So first of all, I should acknowledge who I learned this from, and that's my good colleague in Australia. His name is Gary Foster, and he was the one who shared all this with me. And Gary's work over the years has been on men who've experienced sexual abuse, primarily as children. His work also covers other aspects of sexual violence against men. And yeah, and it was coming across one of those things, that come fresh to you, and it was fresh to me, and it was like, wow, this really kind of captures it all, doesn't it? So I'm going to explain all these words, and to hopefully make sense to you. And then we're going to look at examples of how to give this some understanding, not only about what one's journey is post-trauma, post-abuse, post-assault, but it's going to be talking about our relationship then to that experience. And I think when people come for counseling, come for therapy, yes, they want to talk about what happened way back when, but there's so much else that needs to be part of the presentation in the possibly years, possibly even decades since the original wound, the original trauma, and to today. There's been a variety of mechanisms that survivors utilize to manage their post-traumatic stress pain. We're going to be that's what the focus is of today. If we can make sense of all those ways of managing pain post-trauma, then it's going to give us, I think, a couple of understandings. First understanding is, of course, it makes sense that someone would do many things to manage pain, manage the anxiety, be able to get on with life. And if that then is true, that all these are strategies, or we're going to be defining strategies versus coping mechanisms in just a minute. But I mean, if this is what was required to keep you going, to keep you safe, to keep you from going crazy, to keep you alive, then everything that a survivor does, we can see in this light. Okay, well, this is what has allowed you from having that earlier experience and allowed you to survive up until this moment. So now we're talking about all of that journey up for the survivor, then being this is the material now for trauma counseling. So if you're sitting down with a counselor, this is going to be a good chunk of what you need to work with. And there's a version of this presentation you can present to therapists, and this helps guide therapists about what is trauma therapy and what isn't trauma therapy. So if I can give an example of that, just for you to get a sense of what it's like on the therapist side of the counseling relationship, let's take an issue of not having employment. Now, that may be a presenting issue for a variety of people in counseling and therapy. Is it a trauma therapy issue? We could probably have a discussion on that. Now, if it's the struggles of finding employment, one could say, well, it doesn't sound like it is a component of trauma therapy. However, if that person who's looking for work has a job history of not having an employment situation work out well for them because they have a hard time in people of authority in their lives. So like the role of a boss, a manager, what have you. If that's difficult, and it certainly is difficult for many abuse survivors, then we could say, well, hold on here. Then the employment issue could well be a component of trauma therapy. So I think this exercise helps on both sides, both for the survivor person themselves, possibly as they're considering therapy, but it also provides structure for counselors, therapists, helpers who do this type of work. So let's get into it. I'm going to suggest right now, if you have that pad of paper handy, is to draw this circle that you see on the left of the screen and divide it into four, much like a medicine wheel. And let's talk about the words outside the circle first. If we put all components of one's expression that is connected to the original abuse, assault, what have you, well, that all goes inside the circle. But we need to tease out the differences of our stories. So you're going to see on the left-hand side, you see the word past. Well, past is the past. Anything that has happened goes on the left-hand side of your circle. Anything that is currently still going in your life goes on the left, right-hand side of your circle. Sorry, I'm not too swift on the left and right. Past and present was the dividing line. Okay. Now we're doing the top and bottom differential. On the top, you see the word coping mechanisms. And I think we all have a sense of what coping mechanisms are about, even though they could look quite different for each one of us. We're going to use a definition of coping mechanisms today. Those are things you found yourself doing, you quote unquote, you fell into those behaviors that allowed you to cope from the pain of the original trauma. So when I say that behaviors that you fell into, suggests there was no conscious decision whatsoever on your end. You just found yourself doing things. You found yourself with particular behaviors. Now, I want to differentiate that from the words on the bottom of your screen. And those words are strategies. Strategies are things that we choose to do. Okay, right now one of my current goals is to reduce my caffeine load. each day. So a strategy I'm doing now is to drink decaffeinated beverages after noon hour. That's a conscious strategy of mine. It's not a coping mechanism. Something I'm willing myself to do. Okay, so now we've got the four sides of the circle identified. And then you'll see then contained within the circle the four quadrants. So the first question is regarding quadrant 1. I'm going to read it out to you. My experience of the abuse made me feel or do blank in the past. I fell into those behaviors. Those are coping mechanisms. There's no choice about it. And still, I don't do this anymore. Okay, all that describes quadrant 1. Because it suggests you don't do it anymore, it's on the past side, and it's talking about coping mechanisms, things you fell into. Okay, now that's different than quadrant 2. Still, they're coping mechanisms, things you fell into, yet they're still with you today. Okay, and that's the distinction there. Quadrant 3, now we're talking strategies in the past. It reads, my experience of the abuse made me choose blank as a strategy to manage my post-traumatic stress. I consciously decided to do that, and I don't do that anymore. You may have ideas coming to you on this one as well. And of course, quadrant 4 is the same thing about strategies, certainly, but you're currently doing them. It's happening in the present. If that is clear enough for now, I think what might be helpful is that as a group, we can work on some examples. So I pulled up some, and we can certainly add to it in terms of the discussion. And Becky, if you've got ideas for other examples, and we can certainly add them to the pack here. So let's go ahead here a little bit. Let's talk about probably the first component of post-traumatic stress is dissociation. Dissociation, as we understand it, is a sense of a splitting, really, within ourselves. Because trauma, by its own nature, a traumatic experience is overwhelming for the individual. It creates a memory of the experience that's very disorganized. Traumatic memory is much different than regular memory. I can tell you exactly what I had for dinner last night. And I would think that's true for most of us, because chances are, well, when our dining experience last night was not traumatic, we were able to take in the experience, we were able to encode it in our memory, we were able to decode it and then share back what has happened. This is what we expect memory to do. And yet again, traumatic memory is much different. And what we find often when in the moment of the abuse is a sense of splitting. And the splitting is a very big and general statement, but we can say that dissociation conveys a splitting between our conscious memory of what happened, and that's split from the emotions of what has happened. They're not integrated. They're separate, and they're apart, and some pieces are big and other pieces are missing. And it's like if regular memory was a jigsaw puzzle, say the dining experience of last night, then all the pieces would snap together. There we go. I had a little salad here, and then I had a main course of lasagna, and maybe I had something for dessert, and all those pieces go together. Yet for dissociative memory, because of or dissociative experiences because of traumatic memory, some of those jigsaw pieces are really big, and some of them are very small, and some pieces are missing completely, and the pieces aren't snapping together to make a uniform, cohesive picture. That's how we can describe dissociation. You may have aspects of your own memory, much like, I don't know, much like new clients who call up the clinic I work for looking for help, looking for a therapy. And some fellows tell us over the phone why they're seeking help. And they say, well, you know, at a certain age, maybe I was 10, maybe I was 12, you know, there was an experience I had with an older cousin, and this is what happened, and this is what happened. And yeah, it's been on my mind since, and I thought it would be good that I sit down with the counselor and talk about this. Now, as a person's talking in that way, in that style, in that tone, part of me, if I'm working with them over the phone, I may say, well, what's he really looking for? I'm not hearing the trauma in his voice. You know, I'm not hearing the distress. I'm not hearing the disorganization. I'm not hearing the terror. I'm not hearing the fear. And this is true because maybe what I'm hearing from him in his kind of everyday description of all that is the absence of emotion. So that presentation he's giving me might be a dissociative presentation. And then certainly, you know, we get calls at times from, you know, men who have found us out, and almost immediately they start raging. Oh, yeah, they can say, oh, about time you guys answered the phone. I mean, this is my 5th time trying to get through to it, and I keep getting the damn machine. And, you know, and they're angered, and they're ranting almost from the get-go. And yet I'm still trying to figure out, well, what are they calling for? So I'm not hearing the storyline of what happened. I'm just getting this barrage of emotion. Now, we could call that dissociative anger or dissociative rage. Why? Because it's a different expression from traumatic memory. Long story short, dissociation. It happens right away. And I'm going to suggest this: no one chooses to dissociate. It happens to people. It's a coping mechanism. It's somehow their brain has responded to the overwhelmingness of the abuse by the splitting process. So I don't think there's anyone on this planet who chooses to be dissociative. So with that example, we know that dissociation occurs, or first occurred in the past. And because it's a coping mechanism, not a strategy, it would be placed in the upper left quadrant, quadrant number 1. You could, if that's your story, put a dot there. Put a dot in that upper quadrant and write dissociation down. Now, secondary question around dissociation would be simply, do you still dissociate? And I'm going to suggest that a lot of guys who come in for trauma care that I work with still dissociate, even though that injury, that wound, occurred years, decades later, or decades before. So even though that the experience has occurred way back then, if it's still occurring now, then you may want to put a dot in the upper right quadrant for you of dissociation, because it's still happening to you today. All right, let's look at another example. Drinking, drug use is a very common pattern of post-traumatic stress behavior for folks who've been abused. I know for working with men who've experienced childhood sexual abuse, about 70% of all men now as adults coming into treatment or counseling or therapy, 70% have or have had problems with alcohol and drug use. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that maybe that's true for many of you. However, in order for us to map this, or for you to map this, you're going to have to ask yourself, well, did I fall into this drinking or drug use, or did I consciously choose to do that? And I've heard stories on both sides of that question. Certainly, there are children who've been abused who consumed alcohol or drugs as part of the offending behavior. Okay, so at whatever age they were, their abuser or abusers used substances at the time of the assault. Now, if that was the situation and you were that child, you didn't have any choice in that. You may not even have known what substances were being involved. Doesn't sound like it all would be a strategy. And that would be, then you'd want to map that down in that upper left-hand quadrant. And yet there are other folks, other survivors, who, after being abused, and they feel so horrible, so anxious, so angry, so scared, what have you, they make a conscious decision. Oh, I've seen my parents' friends get into the liquor cabinet, and they always act differently after they drink. I'm going to try that too. Maybe that's going to help me manage how lousy I feel. So that whatever age that kid is, when they choose to get into the liquor cabinet, 12, 15, whatever age, that sounds like a conscious choice. So some of you may have alcohol and drug use in the lower left-hand quadrant because you chose to do that. So if that's the case, wherever, put a dot, write that down in your circle. And of course, now the part 2 question: do you continue to have a problem with alcohol or drugs? If that's still problematic for you, then you need to make reference to that on the right-hand side of the page as well. And again, put the dot accordingly, label it as such, because the more we talk and around different examples, you may be reflective of, oh yeah, I did do that for a while. Oh, I forgot about that thing. And your circle may start filling out, much like men who in our clinic do this exercise when they first come into our group therapy program. All right, let's talk about another post-traumatic behavior that's true of folks of all genders, and that's self-injury. Self-injury, well, when it was first started getting on the map in terms of connection to past abuse, past victimization, a lot of the original research on that came from women who were incarcerated, women in prisons. And well, a lot of people who are prisoners, a lot of people who are incarcerated do self-injure. What the research showed way back when was that it's particularly the women who've experienced childhood sexual abuse with self-injure. And that style of self-injury was often either a cutting process with a sharp whatever, cutting skin, or burning oneself with a cigarette. This is what was originally came through in this research around trauma survivors. Now, there's two pieces to that. One is that research was done entirely on women. As much of the research on sexual abuse and sexual abuse recovery has focused on the lives of girls and women. That's just historically where the emphasis has been. And that, oh boy, we'd go back to that late 70s movement in North America called the second wave of feminism. And that political movement that focused certainly on women's reality, really broke the silence on so much around domestic violence, sexual violence, and what have you. So it's not surprising that the core research on the subject was done with women. But I do want to say that men self-injure too, and sometimes men will cut or burn, but I'm going to say it's more likely that a guy may show self-injury, doing behaviors that fit more within conventional masculinity. And so the two examples that seem to come up fairly often is the notion of getting into fights and almost like looking for it, searching it out, and how that's true for many men's lives. And then the other one is a notion of, as a guy, again, fitting within the male code, putting his fist through the drywall, punching the walls. That's also could be seen as a mode of self-injury for men. Either way we work it, whether it's cutting, burning, whether it's picking a fight, fist through the drywall, the dynamic is the same. And that is what we know about post-traumatic stress is that there's so much, we could call it psychic pain, so much invisible emotional pain. And like anyone else who is in deep pain, the number one strategy is get the hell out of that pain state. So self-injury allows that. If I decide to hurt myself, maybe I'm going to, cut my hand, cut my wrist. In the process of doing that, causing myself physical pain, something happens, and that is that the emotional pain, the psychic pain, reduces because I'm now feeling physical pain. So it does address that chronic pain state that so many survivors live through. And what makes this even more empowering, if I can use that word, is the individual is doing this himself. So they're managing their own pain level. It's not, no one's doing it to them. They're in charge. So we know self-injury is a very potent post-traumatic expression for folks. If you have had any experience around self-injury in your own life, well, two questions. Did you choose to self-injure? Did you maybe, I don't know, saw something on the internet, you saw your best friend cut themselves and you decided, oh, I'm going to give this a go. Or maybe, just maybe, you were by yourself one day in a very pain state and you realized that by putting your hands through your hair, you could kind of start pulling out hairs. And by doing that, it made you feel a little less troubled. So again, was it a coping mechanism or was it a strategy when it first came into your life? If this is true for you, mark that dot in the right quadrant of the circle. And the second part, of course, is do you still self-injure? If that's the case, then mark self-injury on the right-hand side of your circle. Most people don't quit self-injury just like that. From the folks I've worked with, that's often a gradual shift of behavior. And if this is worked on with a counselor, your counselor may suggest to you to not kind of quit a cold turkey, but to choose some other techniques of self-injury that may not cause you harm. So often it's a staged or stepped progress to get to a non-harming self-injury. Now, that may seem strange in just those words for you, but I'm going to suggest this. If you want an example of a non-injurious self-injury, is when you're feeling that the desire to hurt yourself, because you're in a fair bit of psychic pain, Well, go to your fridge and pull out an ice cube and put the ice cube in your hand and make a fist. And if you've never done this before, it doesn't take too long before that hurts like heck. So here we can still employ the device of self-injury to moderate psychic pain, and yet it won't cause any lasting injury for that individual. So again, what works for you? Where do you place self-injury? Which quadrant? When did it start? Did you fall into it? Did you choose to do that? And has it continued into the present? Let's now look at compulsive behaviors, and many survivors of abuse of a variety of forms. They find themselves acting compulsively. What we know about compulsive behaviors is that we can interpret them as being very soothing for the individual. So whether that, we're talking about compulsive shopping, compulsive gambling, compulsive cell phone, social media, or compulsive use of technology, is that there is something very soothing to be, I'd rather not use the word mindless, but it's suggesting a less than a conscious mind when we do these activities. For the survivor to move into a pattern of compulsive behaviors, it suggests that they are less aware, cognizant, self-aware in that regard. So we interpret that as it's a soothing behavior. It's kind of like a they're there, and then finding itself, well, I'm doing this a lot now, aren't I? And doing this, even when I'm not choosing to do this, I'm soothing myself. Now, again, that could be a wide gamut of behavior. Compulsive use of pornography, compulsive masturbation. We could look at elements, certainly, of how that dovetails with alcohol and drug use, possibly. The question for you is, have you found yourself with patterns of compulsive behavior? If so, was it a coping mechanism when you first started doing that? Or was it a strategy? You actually chose to do that. How old were you when that came into your life? And again, all reflective work for you to do. Mark it down in your circle and put the dot in the right quadrant. And as we keep adding things, you may start seeing then there's been a connection between those dots, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. All right. But now, today, what's going on? I'm assuming that the people who are viewing this webinar are survivors, and lo and behold, you're on Survivor Space, and you knew it was coming up, this workshop. It was in your calendar maybe, and here you are. And that's not that much different than if you practice meditation. At some stage, you chose to do that. People don't move into meditation without conscious decision. You didn't show up at the Zero Abuse website to attend this webinar just because you fumbled into it. So here I would think that your decision, you're meditating or you're watching this webinar because you chose to do it. It's a strategy. And if because you're watching the webinar today, it's in the here and now. And yet your meditation, I'd be curious, if you do meditate, when did you start doing that? How old were you? And again, we can get a narrative around each one of these dots, each one of these particular aspects of our post-traumatic story. And this is also part of the reflection work. So there we go. We've got 5 examples now for all of you to consider. what this exercise could mean for you. So here's our last kind of work page, and this is a work page from the exercises we do with men in our treatment program. Now, obviously, we want the men to fill them out. So we can do this in different ways. We can do this on a big whiteboard, and the guys will contribute ideas. They can do it by themselves in their workbooks. It's the same thing. The two examples here. First of all, is dissociation. We know that happens immediately during the course of the abuse or assault. So it's in the past, and it's a coping mechanism. And we know as well of joining the group therapy program, much like joining this webinar, much like joining, much like, maybe developing a meditation practice. If you meditated today, then obviously you're in that bottom quadrant because it's a strategy that you're utilizing in the present. So now the exercise, the work over to you, is to fill in the rest of your trauma story using dots to decipher or tease apart particular behaviors that have come forward in your life since being abused. And as you start filling this out on your own right, I can say once you do a pretty good job at being reflective about all the experiences you've had and marking them in your head, or the coping mechanism strategies, but still do that now. What you may find, apart from the circle now being all filled up with your writing, is that you can also now go back to it and do a bit of a timeline in terms of all these behaviors by, it's kind of like a kids game we all had, when we were small, you connect the dots and start considering whether you can connect the dots in a chronology, in a timeline from the moment of the abuse to where you are at right today. So that's the exercise involved. Now, a couple more things, and then we're going to see get some contributions, hopefully, from your book. Whether you've got 20 dots in this circle or whether you have 200 dots, it doesn't really matter. But just for you to be mindful that you did all those things to survive. And I say that very purposely because many survivors have deep regrets about coping mechanisms they did, strategies that they used to do. They feel shame for those. They feel guilty of how they handled themselves in situations. And while I can understand why they would have possible regrets, the bottom line is that they did all those things to keep themselves alive. And if that is the purpose of what was behind all those variety of behaviors, then in some ways, they don't need to be knocked. They don't need to be, you don't need to feel shame or regret for doing them. They happened in the past and they happened for a reason, and that is to keep you going in your life, to keep you alive, to keep you, you survived through this experience. So I'm, part of the exercise here is to help lift off some of the weight, some of the judgment, self-judgment, some of the guilt, some of the shame. Because truly, no child, regardless of how old you were, no individual can withstand the full onslaught of abuse and trauma. It's overwhelming. So we know the mind works in certain ways to lessen the overwhelmingness of the pain. That's why we dissociate. And we know people do a variety of things in their life to manage, lessen, cope with the pain load that abuse and trauma brings forward in their lives. So that's my message to you. is put that in the proper context. If there are any counselors in the room, then I would say, if you want to do this exercise, well, I'm going to say, regardless of whether you do this exercise with clients, this is a way of understanding where the boundary lies between trauma therapy, being inside the circle, versus other issues that may be in that person's life, but are extraneous to the trauma. So, Becky, I'm going to pass it over to you, and maybe you have any comments, or maybe there's some contributions coming through on chat. And part of the question, of course, for people who are viewing today is, what are examples of things that you have done from the time you were abused to now, and hear whether they can put those experiences in the circle.
Great, thank you, Rick. I'm gonna keep my camera off just so folks can focus on you and the circle on the screen. Nothing in the comments yet, but give folks a chance to think about it. As you were talking, I have, something that came to mind just from my own experience when I was younger, closer to my victimization experience. I was a perfectionist. And I would say, looking back on it, it was almost debilitating. Like I pursued perfectionism because I felt like if I wasn't, good or on it or did everything the right way, then something bad would happen. And as I've gotten older, I realize, I pursued healing and just the wisdom that comes with age too, that like perfection isn't a real thing. And in some cases, and I have to like watch myself, I've kind of gone the opposite direction. Not that I don't pursue excellence in what I do, but like I've fallen into procrastination sometimes, or so I'm just curious if perfectionism or procrastination or things along that continuum are things that you see with folks that you work with as being coping mechanisms or strategies.
Yeah, great examples. Thanks for sharing. We could look at them one at a time. We may find some similarities. I think the notion, though, of I just want to say about procrastination. There's been more engagement, more research on that subject, and it's seen now as primarily an emotional expression. And you go back, though, 10, 20 years, and you see the literature of that, it would all be seen as a problematic thought process, kind of a faulty way of seeing the world or seeing the work in front of you. And I think we're now recognizing, well, that's true. And there may be faulty thinking as one as one procrastinates. The notion is that there's a deeper underlying emotion there, and that is somehow being manipulated through a procrastinating energy. So perfectionism, procrastination. Let's separate those. Let's go for perfectionism. Often, when we're shooting for perfectionism, it's a desire for approval. We were all little once, and man, oh man, the only way we survived being little, of course, is that we would get our needs met by whoever was looking after us, our mom or dad or what have you. And children, we were all wired for survival when we were small. And if the child in their formative years realizes that the only assured way to get the love and affection and everything else that child needs to survive, to grow up, is the approval of parents or the authority figures, well, then it makes good sense to shoot for perfectionism, because it's probably the best chance of receiving that approval. Now, if one grew up in a family where what we could call was a family of secure attachment, where the children got all that TLC that they craved. You know, the children had unconditional love. They had close proximity, you know, with mom, dad, or whoever. That their needs were, the parents were very responsive, very attuned to. We look at those cardinal elements of attachment, secure attachment, you know, just like the baby held in the arms, then there wouldn't be any particular draw for perfectionism. However, when a child is harmed, that secure sense of love and unconditional regard that they may have received from their mom and dad, that goes out the window because the abuse creates this disturbance that we call trauma. So it would make sense, and I'm not saying this about your story, Becky, but it would make sense for a child who has been harmed to double down on behaviors to get the good stuff from mom, dad, the authority figures, because of the experience of being harmed originally. I hope that there's some logic to that, Becky, that you heard, and happy if you have any, if you want to dig deeper into that.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Thank you. And a comment that was very interesting. So yeah, thank you.
I mean, what we can look at here, and I know we're going to do another topic further down in the webinar series of how we develop as, you know, little people in our personalities and how we relate to these big people in our lives. And we can't use adult understanding about how children get their needs met from mom, dad, or whoever. We have to really go back to about how a child's personality forms. And the child's personality really forms on this symbiotic relationship with mom, dad. You know, it's like the child learns to cry and realizes that when I cry, I can get a warm bottle of milk or I can get a fresh diaper. And the child makes that. I mean, they only see the world from their own eyes. It's a very self-absorbed way of relating to the world. And that's how we all were when we were children. So to the notion of perfectionism, we can't kind of do a critique in our adult brains about, oh, the child didn't need to do that, or you know how extraneous that would have been for the child. No, we put ourselves in the child's shoes with the child's developing brain and understanding of how the world works. You know, anything and everything to get mom, dad to approve, mom, dad to give me everything I need to get bigger so I can get on with life is going to be paramount. So perfectionism I would say, makes good logical sense if we put ourselves in the shoes of that child.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And I know I had mentioned this previously when we have talked about this topic before, but because I'm kind of interested in public health and sort of the mind-body connection, a lot of times I have read or have seen where people who have disordered eating, especially folks who are maybe morbidly obese and have an addiction to food, to eating, most of the time, those folks have a history of trauma, not necessarily sexual abuse in childhood, but some type of trauma in their past that they feel eating is the one place where they feel secure, where they have control, something that makes them happy consistently. I'm not sure if that kind of falls along the same line as like drug and alcohol addiction, or if that's kind of its own thing.
I think every behavior has its own spin around these things. So why don't we take that? Why don't we take overeating as an example? Now, here's my guess. I haven't done focused research around compulsive eating, but my guess is that it may stem more as a coping mechanism. Why? Because we all eat. We all have to eat. So that experience of just eating and then maybe eating more and realizing the more I eat, the more I'm feeling my back into my body, and the more I eat may take away from some of the psychic pain. I would think there would be greater chance that it would be a coping mechanism rather than a strategy. It doesn't stem from a conscious decision, because we all eat. And we have been eating ever since we've been born. And that's a little bit different than, someone saying, well, if I hear that someone at the party here's got some, I don't know, some drugs, some coke. Oh, I want to give that a go. I hear that's supposed to make you feel really good. That's a different dynamic, and I think that makes patterns of overeating more challenging to work on, because it's more insidious. Like, where's the line drawn between normal eating and overeating? Like, how much on my plate, where do I see that dividing line? And that's a much greater challenge, I would think, than, oh, I'm I'm going to have a cigarette now. I'm consciously having a cigarette. I know it's not good for me, but I'm just still doing it. There, the line can be drawn I think, much clearer.
Thank you. And there was some agreement with that in the chat. So thank you for addressing that.
Yeah, I know we're getting on time, but just say that, if there's anyone who has a different example, we can work that in the circle as well.
And just a comment related to the eating, overeating or making unhealthy food choices is really complex and very hard to break out of. And I think something you said kind of complicates it, which is that we all have to eat, right? Like, food is legally and legally accessible to folks. It's expected for people to access food, right? So that complicates it. Whereas, drugs and alcohol they may or may not be legally accessible, but they have more of a stigma attached to them.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there are these whatever is shades of gray around many of these coping or many of these behaviors, to figure out what is at its root. When did it come into my life? What was I consciously involved with that decision? And what is this giving me? What's the message on all of these things? What can we decipher in terms of its meaning in our lives?
Yeah. And any last questions or comments, feel free to drop those in the chat. Something else you mentioned earlier in your presentation, Rick, I have a friend who suffered pretty profound abuse in his childhood, and he often talks about being in school and the DARE program that we have in the US. It's like a drug prevention program. I don't know that they use it anymore, but it was a model that was very popular for several years. And there was a police officer who came to give this presentation, and the way he talked about drugs is he kind of framed it as, you don't want to take drugs because they will make you feel different. And my friend, who had been experiencing this abuse and felt horrible, his kind of reaction to that was, well, I don't like how I'm feeling now. So if something is going to make me feel different, then I'm all for it. And of course, that police officer didn't make my friend, get into drugs, but he was obviously predisposed for that. But just it kind of an interesting way of framing that, something that makes someone feel different. Like, a person who hasn't experienced trauma may be like, oh, I don't want to feel different. That sounds scary. But someone who's experienced trauma or abuse may think, I don't know, different might sound pretty good.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if we take the population that's in older communities that are unhoused, that rely upon services like shelters, the folks involved in our addiction treatment centers and 12-step programs, and if we could somehow magically take away the trauma in those people's lives, the attendance rates would be minimal. There we would see so much less pain and distress in our communities from alcohol and drug abuse if there was no trauma in those individuals' lives. And I think this is also an area of recognition that I think we're getting better at, to realize that people just don't have alcohol and drug problems because they are using substances. There's something that has gone on with them before they discovered the alcohol and drugs. And so the presentation is maybe more complex, but there's something deeper going on than just stopping substance use. And I think, with time, our addiction treatment centers and what have you will become more trauma informed. And if they're trauma informed, they're going to have to incorporate this type of understanding in the treatment.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Excellent point. Thank you, Rick. I once heard a presentation years ago quoting someone, and I don't know who to attribute the quote to, but it was simple but pretty profound. And it was, the single most important thing that we can do to affect the well-being of humanity is to stop child abuse. I mean, like, not cure cancer, not, give everybody a livable wage, all these, huge things that we think about, but it's to stop child abuse because it affects so many things and so many people.
Yeah, and yet, I certainly agree with that point, Becky. And yet we know that there's more abuse of children in low-income families, and certainly if children are unhoused, or all these other social issues compound trauma.
Yeah.
And compounds the trauma, it compounds the trauma expression.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've got to both zero in on this topic, and yet we'll need to keep a wider lens to understand all its implications.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, we have come to the end of our hour. Thank you, folks, for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. I'm going to stop the recording.